Hello, welcome to the World Bank Group's Econothon. It's our first day-long live stream around the globe discussing important topics on economics and development. During the next 24 hours, we are coming to you live from the World Bank headquarters in Washington, D.C., and from the regions where we work. We are discussing how strong economics, finance, statistics, and data support our mission to alleviate extreme poverty and build shared prosperity. Since the World Bank was founded 75 years ago, it has become a leader in development finance with deep analytical expertise that supports our lending and advisory work in developing countries. During the Econothon, you'll hear from World Bank Group economists and experts who are working on country programs and projects to highlight the value of data and research, such as the Women, Business, and Law analysis and the Doing Business indicators that help catalyze reforms in country. You will also hear from our clients, the people we work to help. We want to stimulate new thinking and share knowledge about the solutions to the world's toughest challenges and how we can come closer to prosperity for all. I hope you will join us as we look at the challenges, progress, and potential for reducing poverty and improving lives everywhere in the world. I hope you will join our East Asia and Pacific region over the next 2 hours to see the challenges, progress, and potential for reducing poverty and improving lives throughout the region.
Hello, and welcome to the East Asia Pacific segment of the World Bank Group 24-hour Econothon. I am Victoria Kwakwa, the World Bank's Vice President for the East Asia and Pacific region. This region is home to almost 2.5 billion people, from the smallest nation of Tuvalu in the Pacific, with just over 11,000 people, to the economic powerhouse that is China. The region also includes the smaller developing economies of Cambodia and the Lao People's Democratic Republic, as well as the larger developing economies of Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. There are also the small, remote island economies in the Pacific, including Samoa, Kiribati, Vanuatu, and Marshall Islands, with their own unique set of challenges, such as geographic isolation and extreme vulnerability to climate change. East Asia Pacific has led the world in economic growth in recent decades, thanks mostly to high domestic savings and a focus on labor-intensive growth investments in human capital and a stable environment for private investment. This growth has lifted 40% of the region's population out of poverty in the last 20 years. Today, fewer than 1.5% of people live in extreme poverty, on less than $1.90 a day. This is a tremendous achievement. But it is critical to remember, while poverty continues to decline, more than 1/4 of the people in this region are still economically insecure. This means they're just one natural disaster or economic or health shock away from falling back into poverty. And overall, the region is not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, some countries in the region have lost ground relative to some of the goals. The region's past successes suggest that growth could continue delivering unprecedented improvements in welfare. But inclusive growth, that is, growth that reduces extreme poverty while delivering upward mobility and economic security for all, is by no means assured unless countries adopt and implement the right policies and development solutions. This will be essential, especially if they're to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Today, global trade is slowing and trade patterns are changing, The East Asia Pacific region is particularly vulnerable given its dependence on trade, its deep integration into global value chains, and its particular dependence on trade with the US and China. Rapid change in technology is also altering the structure of labor demand. To adjust, countries will need to help workers build new skills. And then, of course, there are the impacts of climate change. 13 of the world's 30 countries most vulnerable to climate change are in East Asia and the Pacific. And this region has experienced the greatest human and economic impacts from natural disasters in the past 20 years, adversely affecting more than 1.6 billion people. The World Bank Group is helping countries across the region reduce their vulnerability to climate change in several ways, including through investments in climate-smart agriculture to ensure food security in the face of a changing climate, protection of coastal and low-lying areas, and investments in climate-smart infrastructure to make sure these critical assets can withstand extreme weather events. Rapid urbanization presents an additional challenge. East Asia and the Pacific is urbanizing at a rate of 2.4% a year. Cities across the region are struggling to deliver infrastructure, jobs, and services for their growing populations. And poorly planned urbanization also increases exposure to natural disasters, as most of the region's large cities are in low-lying coastal areas. This limits the potential of urbanization to deliver economic growth and jobs. But because available resources alone will never be enough to tackle these enormous development needs, new development financing solutions, including leveraging private sector participation and investment, are critical. In that context, together with the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, we're helping develop innovative financing products to engage the private sector in investments for sustainable development in the region. And last but not least, the region also faces another significant challenge: an aging population. A key driver of the region's economic success has been the large share of the working age population who supplied the labor that supported the region's growth. But by 2025, the working age population will begin to decline in most countries in the region, turning this demographic dividend into a demographic tax. Social insurance systems across the region are either underdeveloped or have not accumulated enough resources to support the aging population and keep them out of poverty. Where programs for the poorest elderly already exist, such as in China, coverage will have to expand significantly to keep pace with this demographic trend. In the videos that follow, my colleagues will expand a bit more on these economic development challenges in the region and the cutting-edge solutions the World Bank Group brings. For example, they'll tell you about the work we're doing in the Pacific Islands to help develop climate-smart transportation systems, and in Vietnam to expand climate-resilient land and water use practices in the Mekong Delta. They'll also talk about our work with Indonesia to tackle its major urbanization challenges and boost investment in human capital, and with China to help address the challenges of elder care for its rapidly aging population. And finally, they'll also share with you the innovative financing solutions we've helped develop in Fiji and Malaysia to help involve the private sector in solutions for sustainable development. Also coming up, we have a live event from our Knowledge and Learning Hub in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where experts from around the region will debate the future drivers of growth and sources of jobs in this fast-changing region. Please send us your comments and questions online with the hashtag Econothon. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this segment of the World Bank Group's Econothon from the East Asia Pacific region.
In the East Asia and Pacific region, rapid population and economic growth is driving the expansion of transport infrastructure, such as roads, rail, bridges, ports, and airports. Between 2016 and 2020, the world is expected to spend $5.8 trillion on transport systems. More than 60% of this will be invested in Asia and the Pacific. These systems will increase access to jobs, schools, and services, and will allow goods to travel further and more efficiently. But this infrastructure is also increasingly vulnerable to the growing impacts of climate change, such as storms, extreme heat, and sea level rise. Transport investments that do not factor in climate change pose a threat to lives, assets, and communities. Such investments will also incur large and avoidable maintenance and repair costs in the future. For East Asia and Pacific countries, transport infrastructure must be climate resilient. This is particularly true in Pacific Islands, where airports, roads, and other transport assets are often within the coastal zone. The Pacific Climate Resilient Transport Program, financed by the World Bank, is helping Pacific countries systematically improve the resilience of their transport networks.
Despite many common vulnerabilities, Pacific Island countries have different infrastructure resilience profiles and priorities. The Pacific Climate Resilient Transport Program sets out a strategic framework that addresses this, with individual projects tailored to meet the specific needs of each country. In Samoa, we're helping to enhance the climate resilience of major roads and bridges prioritized by the country's road network vulnerability assessment and climate resilient road strategy, which included a full economic analysis. We're also financing a comprehensive technical assistance package to strengthen the government's capability to manage a more climate resilient road network and enhancing its ability to deliver a rapid response in case of natural disasters.
In countries like Tonga, we've helped the government define new road construction designs with a special focus on slope stabilization and reinforced drainage to increase resilience to heavier and more frequent rainfalls. In Tuvalu, the 20 million maritime infrastructure climate resilient operation focuses on providing a remote and isolated atoll with infrastructure to ensure connectivity to the main island and humanitarian relief in the event of a natural disaster. And the infrastructure design takes into account sea level rise and the likelihood of storm surges.
In the Pacific, World Bank support is designed not only to make physical infrastructure more resilient, but to also strengthen the preparedness of communities and countries. The goal is a climate-resilient future, where kids can go to school, patients can reach hospitals, goods can get to market, and lives and livelihoods can continue without major disruption for many years to come. In the East Asia-Pacific region, climate change presents a major threat to the productivity of agriculture and ecosystems. The region already faces more frequent storms, higher temperatures, reduced water availability, and loss of soil fertility, from both erratic rainfall and increasing salinity in low-lying coastal areas. Many of these impacts will be most severely felt in tropical countries in Southeast Asia, where some crops are already at the limits of their temperature ranges. Vietnam, with over 3,200 kilometers of shoreline, 28 coastal provinces, and more than half of its major cities on the coast, is one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. Sea level rise, extreme rainfall, and more frequent and intense heat waves are all expected to take their toll on the country's people and economy. Natural disasters have cost the equivalent of about 0.8% of Vietnam's GDP annually. Between 6 and 12 million people live in areas at risk of regular flooding. The epicenter of this vulnerability is Vietnam's densely populated and low-lying Mekong Delta, home to 20 million people, many of whom are dependent on rice farming for their livelihoods. Many of these Delta households are near poor, meaning that even small shocks can push them back over the poverty line. Unsustainable use of land and water resources, increasing salinity and erosion along the coastline, and ever higher floods as the sea level rises put the economic future of the Delta region in jeopardy. The Integrated Climate Resilience and Sustainable Livelihoods Project, financed by the World Bank, supports the transition to more climate-resilient water and land management practices in the Mekong Delta, while improving the economic well-being of rural communities. It is also designed to strengthen institutional coordination and introduce climate-smart, integrated planning across the Delta region.
When it comes to climate impacts, we have a fairly good idea of what will happen in the short term. The uncertainty comes when you look at the models over the medium and long term. This is why it's so important to make investments that we know will be beneficial under any climate scenario. These are what we would call low regret or no regret options to adapting to climate change. These options also allow Vietnam to continue to adjust its adaptation strategy as more information becomes available. In the Mekong Delta, this essentially means investing in living with nature. On the ground, this means adaptation interventions like helping farmers transition to climate-resilient aquaculture and agriculture, investing in water management infrastructure in flood-prone areas, rehabilitating dikes, and planting mangroves. It also means setting up monitoring stations and strengthening Vietnam's ability to closely monitor changes in the Delta, including surface and groundwater availability, river and coastal erosion, and saltwater intrusion, and promoting information and data sharing.
The Integrated Climate Resilience and Sustainable Livelihoods Project is still in its early stages, but it's already shown results enabling a more integrated approach to sustainable delta-wide development. Work has already started on developing a coordinated financing platform to meet the region's sustainable investment needs. And the bank's engagement has enabled shifts in how the central and provincial governments are adapting to climate change in the Mekong Delta. The hope is that in the future, other countries facing the growing impacts of climate change will be able to learn from Vietnam's experience of investing in living with nature. Despite robust economic growth and a rapid decline in poverty rates, the East Asia Pacific region still has many pressing development needs, such as bridging its infrastructure gaps and building climate resilience. New financing solutions are critical to further progress, including attracting high-quality private sector investment in key areas. Climate change poses an unprecedented threat and disproportionately affects the East Asia Pacific's most vulnerable populations. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen an alarming rate of carbon emissions, resulting in the hottest global temperatures ever on record. East Asia and Pacific is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for 1/3 of the world's carbon dioxide emissions and 60% of its coal consumption. The region plays a critical role in advancing the global climate change agenda. The World Bank Group is supporting innovative finance solutions targeted to climate resilience and sustainability, and is working with individual countries to develop tailored approaches. In Malaysia, this meant bringing together Islamic finance and green bonds to develop a new class of solutions.
The emergence of green Islamic bonds, or green sukuk, as a new financing instrument allows investors from the Islamic world and non-Islamic investors to contribute to global efforts to ensure sustainability. This innovative move of marrying Islamic finance and green finance opens up new channels of financing as investors around the world become more aware of the threats posed by climate change.
Green Sukuk was very exciting for us. Not only is it the first green sukuk in the world, but more importantly, it's actually assisting our client to raise funding of their solar project. Cost-wise, to get the green sukuk, it's a nominal sum that the client's very happy to pay. It's insignificant to the overall cost. I don't think it will be an impediment for anybody to try and get the green certification.
The whole process took us about 3 weeks for us to obtain the highest level of certification, which is dark green. It is cost efficient, which is a very, very nominal cost for green issuance.
It is the first time we do a project of this scale in the country. So we need to ensure that in structuring funding for a project like this, We mitigate all the risks and we have to ensure certainty. This coupled with the fact that it is a green project, I think it makes it appealing.
More and more investors have been making their investments green and sustainable. Since 2017, Malaysia has seen 6 green sukuk issuances, and that number is set to rise. Indonesia and the United Arab Emirates have also issued green sukuk. To date, $3.5 billion of green sukuk have been issued.
Since the launch of the Green Sukuk 2 years ago, thanks to the innovative efforts of a technical working group formed by the World Bank, the Central Bank of Malaysia and the Securities Commission of Malaysia, there's been growing interest by both corporate and sovereign issuers in this new financing tool. Looking ahead, we hope to unlock its full potential to finance a green and sustainable future.
In 2017, Fiji became the first emerging market to issue a sovereign green bond to support climate change mitigation and adaptation.
The Pacific island nation of Fiji stands on the front lines of climate change. Home to almost 1 million people, Fiji has 300 volcanic islands, including low-lying atolls, which are highly susceptible to a changing climate. In 2016, Tropical Cyclone Winston, one of the most intense tropical cyclones in the Southern Hemisphere on record, passed directly over Fiji, causing economic losses amounting to almost 1/3 of GDP. Fiji wanted to show the world a small island nation could find new sources of funding from private investors to help meet at least a small part of the needs to build up its resilience to a changing climate. Fiji wanted a green bond. While the World Bank Group is among the pioneers of green bonds, an emerging economy sovereign had never issued its own. We were in new territory as advisors. Only France and Poland had issued sovereign green bonds, so we had to be creative, drawing on our treasury expertise, connecting with France to share its knowledge, and mobilising experts to deliver a full package of support in record time. We'd just set up an IFC capital markets project in Fiji, so could answer yes to their request. Working in a global practice, traversing IFC and the World Bank is second nature to us. We found our experts from Singapore's IFC Treasury, Washington's Bank Treasury, and the SIR Global Practice in our Sydney and Fiji offices, who just happened to have finished a climate vulnerability assessment in the country.
Innovative finance solutions and partnerships can help set the stage for a more resilient future. By working together, we can build a safer, more sustainable world for ourselves and for future generations.
Welcome to the World Bank Econothon in Malaysia. We're streaming live from Kuala Lumpur, and of course we're going to be discussing the challenges and drivers to jobs and growth in East Asia, as well as the policy efforts in this region. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel, if we can. On my left is Professor Yee Bin Huang. He is the Professor for the National School of Development at Peking University. On his left is Dr. Federico Gil-Sander. He is the World Bank's lead country economist for Indonesia, based in Jakarta. And on Dr. Gil-Sander's left, in turn, is Dr. Andrew Mason. He's the acting chief economist for the East Asia Pacific region for the World Bank. And then, of course, bookending of this panel is Dr. Noor Ain Shariah, professor of economics for Sunway University out of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Thank you all for joining us. Now, if we can start with you, Professor Huang, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges for the region with respect to promoting jobs and creating growth in the future?
Well, I think most of the Asian economists at the moment are facing this challenge of moving from middle income to high income. And on the way, you distract a lot of jobs in the traditional industries and trying to create new jobs in the new industries. For China, specifically, our income level, GDP per capita, was 2,600 in 2007. Last year, it was close to $10,000 US. So that's kind of a job means you needed to move up the industrial ladder, and you're going to lose a lot of jobs in the older industries. The question is, you're going to create enough new jobs. At the moment, we're also facing an additional challenge, the China-US trade friction, which is also leading to additional loss of jobs. So I think there are lots of forces imposing challenges for job creation at the moment.
Dr. Gilsander, in your part of the world, Indonesia, Jakarta, what are your thoughts in terms of the challenges to jobs growth and, in fact, economic growth in your part of the world?
I think that for East Asia as a region, in the short term, as Professor Wan said, I think that the trade tensions can be an important challenge for everyone in terms of the importance of trade for East Asia and the importance of trade in promoting productivity growth in the region. In the longer term, and these apply certainly to Indonesia as well, we think that the key challenge is going to be to build human capital and to build a human capital in the region. In Indonesia, I think that there needs to be an improvement both in the future labor force, in terms of the quality of education, in terms of reducing and eliminating stunting, so that the labor force of the future has the skills to deal with technological change. But it's also important to know that technology is coming today, so retraining the current labor force is also something that is going to be important to continue to maintain job creation and growth. In the specific case of Indonesia, I think that also continuing to close the infrastructure gap, building infrastructure is very important for firms to be productive and to be able to access markets. So that's going to be critical. And then finally, to attract more foreign direct investment. In the case of Indonesia, it attracts relatively little FDI. And we have, through our research, shown that more FDI actually creates more and better jobs for Indonesians.
Dr. Mason, your bird's eye view of the region. What's your point of view in terms of the challenges to growth in the region?
Yes, so I think the challenges to growth and job creation in the region need to be set against the great success that many countries in the region have already had in terms of growth and poverty reduction. And this success has really been built largely on export-oriented manufacturing and a very outward-oriented stance. Now, what we see, the trade frictions, of course, as my colleagues have mentioned, are important, but even before the trade friction started, we saw that growth in global trade had begun to slow, particularly trade in goods, and technologies are changing very rapidly. So countries in the region need to adapt to the changing external environment and changing technologies in order to be successful. I think, for example, one thing we see is that services exports are growing faster than goods exports. So the challenge is to gear up in that direction. And then I think with technological change, that building up skills. So human capital, as Federico said, is going to be a very important challenge in the coming years.
Dr. Noain, you're both part of the same part of the pond. Yes. In your opinion, what are Malaysia's biggest challenges when it comes to growth?
Yes, I think most of the challenges have been highlighted by my colleagues here, but two prevalent challenges that I would like to highlight is first, Malaysia, the intractable external shocks, not only the trade war between the US, but with the China, but also, the potential of Brexit happening and the tense in the Gulf regions. So when there is external shocks, there will be capital outflows. And in Malaysia, within a week, we can see, potential capital outflows only in the equity market can be up to like 1 billion ringgit. So when there is significant capital outflows, domestic currency, ringgit will depreciate. And if Malaysia, for instance, last year we spent almost 45 billion on imported fresh fruits, frozen vegetables and meat. So the depreciations of currency will lead to reducing in the real purchasing power of the Malaysians and also affecting the healthy dietary. So, the repercussions of the ringgit depreciating as a result of the, response to the external sector shocks. And secondly, what I wanted to highlight is the premature deindustrializations in which our manufacturing sectors, as highlighted by Dr. Mason just now, the productions of goods and services, so premature deindustrializations in which our manufacturing sector that is falling apart. It's falling behind. And this is evidence from the Malaysian manufacturing value added, in which from 1999 to 2005, it stands about 31%, but now it is only at 23%. And employment share in manufacturing as well is declining. So premature industrializations would have negative impact to the economic growth in ASEAN countries like Malaysia, for example.
Yeah, absolutely fair points. We're going to get your granular details on that in a few minutes. But just to come back to you, Professor Huang, you talked about how the increasing automation in China is one of the, what can be perceived as a challenge. But it's also an opportunity because obviously with 1.5 billion people and many of them, a great swath of them very young, it's a great opportunity for them. In terms of your point of view, what is the opportunity for growth in China?
Well, I guess it's both a challenge and an opportunity. We used to have, for instance, 300 million migrant workers, farmers coming into the cities and getting jobs. Most of them concentrate in the labor-intensive manufacturing industry. But now wages are rising so quickly, we start to lose competitiveness in that industry. Automation is happening. So I think one big challenge there is that if these 300 million farmers lost jobs in the cities, where they're going to go? I think this is a big challenge we're facing. There are certainly a lot of opportunities. Automation helped to mitigate the wage pressure, the cost pressure, and that's why a lot of industries in China remain competitive. But industrial upgrading or innovation is probably the key word for job creation. If you look at the Chinese economy today, on the one hand, you find that the fight between the new and old industries is an ongoing process. So we're losing jobs in the old industries, but a lot of new jobs are being created in the new industries. New industries could include things like 5G, new material, new energy, AI, and so on. But it could also include things like just upgraded electronic products, automobiles, and so on. A lot of new jobs are being created. And you look at, for instance, Alibaba, the primary online shopping company. It's the company itself alone just employed more than 10 million workers directly or indirectly. So jobs are being created. As I said, the challenge has been very significant. One additional factor we needed to consider is that China is already entering this aging process. So we start to lose the working age population. And that's why, while the restructuring is going on and the growth is slowing, but overall the unemployment rate remains stable. So I think we're coping with the problem okay, but the challenge is very significant.
Yeah, good points in terms of human capital development and in terms of the aging population. So we'll get some granularity on that, Professor Huang. But to turn to you, Dr. Gil-Sander, you talked about the paucity of FDI on a relative basis to Indonesia and the importance of infrastructure. Can those two large ideologies be a catalyst for growth in your part of the world?
Yes, absolutely. We see a lot of opportunities going forward for FDI, including export-oriented FDI, to be a big catalyst for growth and job creation in Indonesia. People think that, well, with automation, with the trade wars, is this a good time to actually try to attract export-oriented FDI? But I think that people forget that East Asia also has a very large emerging middle class. They want to continue buying consumer goods in an increasing amount. They want to continue buying more unique foods, for example, so there's potential for growth even in the agricultural industries. And of course, the demand for tourism is increasing very sharply. So I think that the kind of FDI, the kind of investments that actually target exports of both goods and services, as Andy was mentioning, I think that has a lot of potential for creating jobs going forward.
Yeah, like an emerging market fund manager friend of mine said, a lot of people in emerging Asia want to have to be a carbon monoxide polluter and to have high blood pressure from eating consuming consumer goods. But Dr. Mason, to turn to you as well, you talked about how large picture issues like the trade tensions and all that can be a deterrent to growth, but it's also seen as an opportunity for recipient countries, perhaps, for example, Vietnam and even Malaysia, from a theoretical basis. What are your points of view in terms of the opportunities for growth in the region?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the trade war, the trade tensions themselves, I think we see that countries are trying to understand where they can benefit and what the costs are. But I think actually in the big picture, our view is that as long as there are trade tensions, overall we're going to see losers. So there will be relative winners and relative losers, but I think really at the World Bank we really support the notion of rules-based sort of global trading system which can provide the opportunities that it's provided for growth over the last decade or more. But in terms of looking to the future, I think the prospects for growth will require a focus on increasing productivity growth. We've seen since the global financial crisis that productivity growth has slowed globally. And in developing East Asian countries, we've seen the same. So there are several sources of potential productivity growth in the future for developing East Asian countries. Professor Huang mentioned innovation, and this will be a very important piece of the puzzle. I think focusing on high value-added services and liberalization of services trade will be very important. I think improving the financial sector architecture to ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises have access to capital, and improving the linkages between internationally linked firms and domestic firms will also be an important part of the story.
Okay, and to turn to Dr. Noor Ayn, my fellow Malaysian, you talked about how deindustrialization could be a potential deterrent to growth, but obviously Malaysia is a country which is well diversified in terms of the economy. It is a country which is still enjoying 4 to 5% growth, which is obviously growth which is the envy of the developed world. And I think today the Central Bank of Malaysia mentioned that fears of a global recession might be a little bit overblown. In your opinion, Dr. Noor Ayn, what are the opportunities for growth in our country?
Okay, so if you translate the economic growth to the, represented by the GDP number, so it is largely driven by consumptions for Malaysia. I think 52%, like last year we have about 4.9 or 4.7% of GDP growth, but 52% largely comes from the consumptions, private consumptions. So these private consumptions, you have to look at it into the granular or what drives this consumption and how it is driven. So if the private consumptions but driven by loans, driven by debt, that is not going to be sustainable. So investment in the real sectors, like mentioned by the colleagues, on the productivities, on the SMEs, access to the capital. So that is the catalyst of economic growth for Malaysia, and that has been shown. Manufacturing sectors have been shown as the drivers of the growth, before the 1987 Asian financial crisis as well. So, to revive back our manufacturing sectors is, I would say, more important and more sustainable, because then it will reduce our reliance on imported goods. And then we will have stable price and purchasing power among the Malaysians. Just now, I think Dr. Minson did mention about the SMEs access to the capital, but it is not only access to the capital, but also the absorptive capacity of these SMEs. Are they able to absorb the spillovers and the knowledge transfers from the foreign multinationals that come to the country? Like as Dr. Federico mentioned about we need to have the foreign direct investments, but to what extent does the foreign direct investment that come to the country provide the knowledge transfer, provide the spillovers to the local SMEs, especially in terms of innovation, in terms of the technological transfers, knowledge transfers and stuff. So I think more importantly is that, if we want to revive back our industrial manufacturing sectors, we need to have absorptive capacity among the SMEs, and to have that, we need to have high human skills. And to have high human skills, we need to have better education systems. So at least that is, in particular, zooming in the context of Malaysia.
Excellent points of view. I'm going to drill down on those points of view in a few minutes when we come back round again, Dr. Noor Ayn. But to come back to you, Professor Huang, you talked about how there's an aging society in China, I think, which is a malaise most of the world is undergoing right now. From a policy perspective, what is China doing, not just in terms of an aging population, but in terms of making sure that growth is sustainable for the long term?
Well, the key challenge is how to support innovation. And that is the most important issue. Aging is a big problem for China, and some people once called getting older before getting rich. That's a very serious challenge. But we have done some work recently looking at the challenge itself. Aging itself probably will pose a number of challenges. Number one, when the society gets old, consumption weakens, and that would have some impact on growth momentum. Number two, aging means the jobs will be lost and there will be less labor supply. In fact, we did an estimation looking at the next 30 years from 2019 to 2049. China probably would lose something like 200 million workforce people, and that's a big challenge. And then there will be other challenges for social welfare spending and so on. But the question now is there a way of dealing with that problem, especially shrink of the labor force over time, about 200 million. I guess the question now is, do we have enough investment and innovation to automate the production process and apply the AI, the robots, and so on to substitute for the lost labor? Our study concluded that over the next 30 years, if we do right, labor substitution could actually amount to something like 280 million workforce, which means if we do right in terms of innovation, automation, that problem can be mitigated. But at the same time, there's an additional challenge. That is related to what I mentioned earlier. We have 300 million migrant workers working in the cities. The average education level is junior high school. And now the income level, the wage rate is so high, but the education level is still relatively low. The question is, can all these people still be employed in relatively more sophisticated industries and services? So I think in terms of policy recommendations, it comes down to 2 points. Number one, as I said, whatever the government needs to do and can do to facilitate innovation in the economy, it will be vital. And one of the particular area to focus on is to support development of the SMEs, the small medium enterprises. Most people think the big companies support innovation, but the Chinese private enterprises, mostly SMEs, contribute something like 70% of the local patents, which means going forward, how to support the SMEs is the key for supporting innovation and creating more jobs going forward. That's the first policy recommendation, and I can think of. The second thing is certainly trying to build and grow human capital with this 300 million migrant workers, and these 2, I think, would be the pillar of the policy framework.
Yeah, Professor Huang, the fear of being left behind is exacerbated in China because of the sheer size of your population. 300 million migrant workers being left behind is a great fear for the social system in China. structurally speaking, it's very tough to get an old dog to learn new tricks, as all of us know. As we go past a certain age, it's very hard to skill up, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's in data analytics, whether it's in software programming. I think, Dr. Mason, in America, there's an individual named Andrew Yang. He's proposing a universal basic income to bridge the transition between being left behind and being self-sufficient going forward. Structurally speaking, is China being unrealistic in imposing innovation on a population which is really from a rural background?
Well, I think this is a very broad question. Innovation should be done in China, but China has a very large population. I don't think everybody of this 1.4 billion people will need to do innovation by themselves. Most of the people will follow and learn the skills and to perform on the job. So I actually think that's not an unachievable task for China to accomplish, while the challenge is serious, how to improve their human capital. You look at the Chinese economy at the moment, they're actually all doing pretty well. In many companies, one worker used to perform a job on one spot, and now they're looking at a very large site. They're all doing quite well. So I think a lot of human capital accumulation will be done on the job, not necessarily go back to the university to learn the new skills. What they needed to do is to adapt to the new environment, which probably employs a new technology. But I think my observation at the moment, I think that whether you look at the labor force, you look at the industry, it's actually transitioning pretty well. The industry is moving up, and most people still remain employed.
Okay. Dr. Gilsander, similar issues in your part of the world, in Indonesia. Human capital development for a country which is growing as fast as Indonesia is a challenge. How do you view policy efforts in terms of reviving this front?
I think that there are some very encouraging efforts in Indonesia in terms of reviving human capital. Indonesia has a serious challenge of tackling childhood stunting. As of only childhood stunting, when children are in their first 1,000 days, they actually don't have the right weight or height for the age. So regardless of how tall people grow up to be eventually, for the first 1,000 days is actually quite standard, and those are quite critical. It's a quite critical period in the place.
Is that a nutrition issue, or is it an environmental issue? Is it a weather issue?
It's largely a nutrition issue. And it does affect how well children then are able to learn and are able to succeed in the labor market later in life. So we've estimated that in today's labor force of Indonesia, about 54%, more than half of today's labor force, were actually stunted as children. They did not get the right nutrition to grow sufficiently in the first 1,000 days. So that is a huge challenge for the country. So obviously in today's labor force, it's 54% that has gone down now to 30% of the children. And the government is actually having a very concerted effort to continue to reduce that number further down the line. So that's a very important effort so that the future labor force is actually going to have the skills that it needs to deal with this advancing technology and to be able to innovate.
Well, that's going to have serious repercussions on productivity for the economy, especially one the size of Indonesia's 240 million people. In your opinion, what is the Indonesian government doing to address the nutritional deficiencies among its population, not just in terms of spend, but in terms of getting people out to the entire archipelago?
So stunting is not only just a pure nutrition issue. There is enough food in Indonesia. Sometimes it's an issue of eating the right food, and for the mothers also to eat the right food during pregnancy. Sometimes it could be a sanitation issue because you might eat, but then you might end up with some kind of a stomach disease, and you might end up losing the nutrition that way. So the challenge with nutrition and with stunting is that it requires a lot of coordinated interventions in sanitation, in providing the right prenatal care, the right health care, and the right food to children. So it's this coordination that now the government is actually working to have in villages all across the archipelago. So I think this is a challenge that they've now set themselves to overcome.
I'm sorry, this is very interesting. So I'm going to get some more of your points of view, Dr. Gilsander. Is this an opportunity for foreign corporations, multinationals, to come in and say, look, let's address this problem. It's a technology solution we might be looking for. It's a logistics opportunity that we could be looking for. Is that one way forward?
I think that technology certainly plays a role, and the government is looking into that, because precisely that you need to actually have this good data on whether things are actually being properly coordinated. Is the place that is receiving the nutrition intervention also getting the right sanitation intervention, also getting the right healthcare intervention? So this is actually a program that the World Bank is supporting in Indonesia that is also bringing this technological aspect to have a better data system to know where these interventions are taking place, because you do need all of them to come together in order to really solve the problem.
Okay, Dr. Mason, from the granularity of China and Indonesia, what's your bird's eye perspective of structural reform in East Asia?
Okay, I'd like to pick up, because several of the panelists, or actually all of them, have mentioned this point about human capital. Right. And I think this is very, very important as part of the puzzle for growth and job creation in the future. So human capital is not only education. We tend to focus on that. That's a very important piece of the puzzle. And in fact, countries in developing East Asia have done a very good job at bringing children into the education system at the primary and at the secondary level. But many countries still face a learning deficit, which is different than, traditionally we focused on enrollments, but actually we understand very well that it's not only getting children into the seats in school, but it's really the learning outcomes and the skills that are imbued during the education process that are going to propel people productively into the future. So there's a very important policy agenda in many of the countries in the region, and this applies both to the upper middle as well as the lower middle income countries in the region to improve learning outcomes. And this means not only improving the quality of education in the traditional sense, but beginning to build skill sets for the 21st century economy. So this includes, for example, building socio-emotional skills, promoting creativity, not only rote learning, helping children learn to work in teams, helping children to become digitally literate. So this point about technology, if children go through school and graduate and don't have a conversance, even with how to use a smartphone, for example, then they're at risk of being left behind. So the human capital agenda, whether it's stunting, whether it's education and skills development, this is an extremely important foundation for the growth and jobs agenda going forward. And just to build on what Federico is saying, in recognition of the importance of human capital, just under a year ago, the World Bank launched something called the Human Capital Project, specifically to work with governments in developing countries to strengthen these aspects of human capital development for promoting growth. Then I think the next piece of the puzzle for developing East Asia is to open up services sectors. So we've seen very strong progress, as I said earlier, in liberalizing goods trade. But the future of trade, I think, is really going to be in services trade. And right now, while East Asian economies have done very well in liberalizing goods trade, they've done worse than the average economy worldwide in liberalizing services trade. So this I think, is a second very important key component of the structural reform agenda.
Yeah, I'd like to delve into two key points that you made. First of all, Dr. Mason, you talked about how these conceptual ideas, they sound good on paper, but obviously East Asia is a highly fragmented, highly countryed region. Many countries traveling at different speeds, Singapore being a clear example of one that is way ahead of the pack. In your opinion, which countries are moving faster and which countries are moving slower, and which are showing the best hallmarks of upskilling its people?
Yeah, so it's absolutely a heterogeneous region, no doubt, both in terms of sort of the level of development and in terms of the specific development challenges. I wouldn't try to generalize across all of these countries, but let me say that, for example, on human capital, we see that, yes, Singapore has done very well, Korea has done very well, that there are lessons from from these countries in terms of how to strengthen the education and skills base in the developing East Asian economies. Just to say that one very important but sometimes missing ingredient across the developing countries in the region is a focus on teachers and strengthening teacher quality and teacher training, because it's really through the strength of the teachers that knowledge and learning is conveyed.
I wonder if you can expand on that idea for us, Dr. Mason, the teacher training aspect of the upskilling aspect. How is Singapore and how is Korea doing it right in this aspect?
Yeah, so one thing that these countries do is that they spend a lot of time, first of all, they value teaching. Sort of in many education systems around the world, teachers who are successful are then moved into administrative positions. And you lose the benefits of that experience and the ability to convey learning and to convey knowledge. So the systems in Singapore and in Korea are a bit different in that respect. They really focus on teachers who are very skilled at being teachers, then also providing mentorship to younger teachers. There's a lot more time also spent in sort of interaction and nurturing between teachers, and really a premium put on quality teaching that we don't see in many other parts of the world. So this is an important piece of that puzzle.
And just the second part of your earlier discourse, Dr. Mason, you talk about how the importance of goods trade and goods flow and services flow between the regions. There's been some inertia when it comes to trade agreements between Asia and the rest of the world. Certainly the agreement between North America and Asia has been stunted somewhat by the advent of Donald Trump's ascension to office. Are you concerned that the North American portion of trade with East Asia is now somewhat stunted?
Well, I think what we want to see is a deepening of trade agreements, ideally globally, but certainly if not even regionally. So, for example, the CPTPP, to which Malaysia has ascribed, Vietnam has ascribed, Singapore. This is what we would call a deep trade agreement and facilitates, for example, protections of foreign investment, protections of intellectual properties, a number of things that will really help to propel not only trade but investment, as well as deepening of services and services integration. So there are many ways to get at this, but I think being realistic, we look for the opportunities where we can.
Absolutely. Dr. Noor Ayn, our country, obviously moving at different speeds to the Singapores and the South Koreas of this world when it comes to upskilling our people. I think now mention has been made of a return possibly to the use of English in the teaching of science and mathematics in our schools. Obviously that must come as a bit of a surprise to some of our more developed neighbours. Do you think Malaysia's government, the new government, is doing the right thing in terms of moving back the country to the median average where education is concerned?
So do you mean in terms of the implementations of English?
Well, as a base case, but then moving forward to the industrialization, to the re-industrialization of the country and the innovation aspects of the country.
Yeah, so that is debatable. In other words, some would argue that language is a medium of communications. It's not, you can teach mathematics, you can teach science in any language, but the most important thing is the way that these technical subjects are taught. We can see some of the countries that they don't even teach these subjects like robotics, computer, or mathematics and science in English, but they thrive. So the thing is that what is the impact of teaching English in mathematics and science? Because not everyone would have access to good communications, even teachers as well. We need to equip the teachers, as mentioned by Dr. Mason just now, in terms of English communications. So there will be many layers if we are trying to adapt back the English as a medium of communication, medium of teaching, especially to teach subjects like science and mathematics, and it has to be done gradually in stages. But I think yes, it it is important because we are moving and we are putting ourselves in the global world, and English communication is very important indeed. But we have to make sure that those in the rural areas, even teachers as well, have access to better communications, have access to training that can improve the English communications. It's not only focusing on the students per se, but most importantly is that the educators, they should also be able to be equipped with trainings and learning English fluently. Yeah.
So from a structural standpoint, from a rule book perspective, what would you recommend to the government, to the Education Minister, Dr. Masleen Malik? How would you tell them to move forward when it comes to upskilling teachers and teachers teaching teachers to get the best quality education to the young of Malaysia?
In my point of view, we need to make our education sectors more competitive. That means we need to have more equal opportunities to everyone to become teachers, to have access to the universities, while ensuring that the marginalized group, regardless of whether they are Malays or the Chinese or the Indians, are going to be left out. So
there are political repercussions to that
yes,
movement.
so that's why we need leaders that can take these bold measures moving forward. But but that is something very tricky, because when political come into play, political starts to interfere in economic sectors, in the political situations, it can have impact on the education sectors, can have impact on the economic sector. So, but if we want the country to move forward, we need to ensure greater opportunities, more competitive in terms of for the education sectors.
Dr. Gil Sander would obviously have intimate knowledge of this country's challenges when it comes to politicization of the education sector. I'm sure you have seen this up close and personal when you were in charge in your tenure here in Malaysia, Dr. Gil Sander. What are the repercussions to Malaysia's competitiveness and productivity going forward if it continues to allow its education sector to be politicized for political gain?
I think that Malaysia does face a big challenge. I mean, it's done a lot of things right, and I think that, as Andy was saying, I think that getting the children in school has been very important, and it was a very important story of Malaysia's success to get where it has, right? So the fact that by the 1980s you already had 100% enrollment, that actually is part of Malaysia's success, because you would not have been able to have the industrial base without having people who are at least minimally skilled. But now the challenge that we've had in recent years is that it's really this focus on the quality. And I think that there are some, and I think that Professor Nurain might be better placed than me to talk about the kind of the politicization of what might explain why the increase in enrollment has not been able to be followed by a greater focus on quality. I mean, we still have seen a lot of issues with the international test scores, and really the fact that the universities have not been able to also provide the pipeline of teachers that actually want to join the basic education to restore and to improve the quality of students in Malaysia.
Yeah, Professor Huang, if I can get into the discussion as well. I think earlier Dr. Nurain was saying that there are attendant challenges when it comes to technology transfer between foreign investment corporations or foreign investing corporations into Malaysia. I'd like to point out a success story here. I think Geely of China came into the automotive sector with its partnership with Proton. You've taken a 49% stake in the production capacity of Proton cars, whereas the Malaysians have taken a 51% controlling stake. But that transfer of technology and know-how has really been borne out in car sales. For the first time in its 35-year history, Proton cars are now selling like hotcakes. On a quality perspective, not on a monopoly perspective. Is this a model that should be pursued between China and Malaysia going forward, where you come in, you take some skin in the game and some significant skin in the game so that everybody benefits?
I think that's a great program if you see that's beneficial for Malaysia. But unfortunately, this is becoming a very controversial issue now in the US-China trade talks. Some people talking about forced transfer of the intellectual property rights by foreign companies to the Chinese joint ventures. I do think we needed to, the Chinese policies need to change, for instance, to allow for more wholly owned foreign companies and so on. But if this is what you see beneficial, and I certainly would be very supportive, I think it's beneficial for both parties. Chile would be benefiting from this joint venture by accessing to a huge market, but also sharing its own technology and with the other companies. And I think Chile and many of the other Chinese automobile companies also benefited in the same way when they formed a joint venture with foreign companies. And that's the way we attract a lot of FDI, but also learned a lot of new technology.
Professor Huang, you mentioned the disputes between the Chinese and Americans when it comes to the perceived technology transfer. Some people would say it's actually an ideological battle, not really a technological or intellectual property battle. It's basically, to put it simply, the Americans are not happy that the Chinese are now the top dogs, or will soon be the top dogs in the room. Is this a fallacy or is it a reality?
Well, I can only say the current friction looks like is a bit beyond just the trade and economic competition. Many of the demands raised by the U.S. government on economic policy issues, I don't think they're very different from what the Chinese government want to do anyway. For instance, better protection of intellectual property rights, opening up the service sector, and also reducing the role of the government in allocating resources. I think these are what the government planned to do, and they probably can do better. Just over the last week, we heard the Chinese government announced a further 11 measures in opening up the financial services sector. But some of the measures the U.S. is undertaking in terms of the tech sector and more broader measures, they certainly look a bit more than just economic competition. I'm an economist, so I don't have any insights on strategic competition and so on, but it does look like much more complicated.
Dr. Mason, judging from your accent, you must be from the North American region. Do you have a counter to that point of view?
No, look, I think the important thing from a development perspective when we think about trade is that these trade frictions are hampering the development and growth of the global trading system. And that is having costs not only for developing East Asia, but having costs around the world. In fact, just yesterday, the International Monetary Fund downgraded their growth estimates for global growth, and in large part due to trade frictions. So without getting deeply into the whys and wherefores, like Professor Huang, I'm an economist, and what I can tell you is that these trade frictions are having costs to everybody, and are not good for global growth, are not good for poverty reduction worldwide, are not good for shared prosperity, the things that, as the World Bank, that we're seeking to promote. So, again, you asked earlier about the winners and losers within the region, and I just want to reinforce the idea that there are only relative winners and losers, but in a trade friction or even an all-out trade war, what we see is that everybody loses in some capacity.
Okay, I guess it's time to move on to the questions, and we've got plenty of questions coming from the live streams, and in particular, I think, from the Philippines. If we can start with a question from Steph from the Philippines. She's eager to find out how the panelists think about things like jobs, the fourth industrial revolution, and agriculture-related issues. So I think the region falls to you, Dr. Mason. What's your initial thought?
Okay, so on the fourth industrial revolution, I know that many of our counterparts in developing East Asia are very fascinated and also very concerned with the prospect that automation is going to take jobs away. And I think I would like to reframe the way that we think about the issue. Certainly concerns about automation, thinking ahead about how to prepare for that, both in terms of the regulatory environment and the skills base, is very, very important. But the third industrial revolution, which is really about getting digital access to everybody is still, I think, a pending agenda in most of the region. What we want to do, digital technologies is a very, very powerful tool for many, many people across the spectrum of society. Cell phones, smartphones in the hands of Mongolian herders and rice farmers in Vietnam is giving them access, for example, to real-time data on prices and on weather, things that can help them be more profitable and more effective as farmers. It's closing geographic distance and giving people access to markets. It's improving information about labor markets to help employers and aspiring workers match. So I think there's a very big agenda with respect to ensuring that digital technologies are universally available and affordable. And rightly or wrongly, I'll call that the third industrial revolution. There are some important issues around the fourth industrial revolution that we need to think through carefully, those of us who think about development. So automation in China, for example, will not only affect the labor force in China, but will affect the value chains that have been very important in the region. So to the extent that China automates and perhaps claws back some of the production that it might otherwise have outsourced, that has spillover effects to other countries in the region, and we need to be looking very carefully at that in the future.
Okay. Yes. Can I add a point? I think the application of the digital technology, I agree with Andy, certainly has both positive and negative sides of it. Just like to share an example of the Chinese story, the application of digital technology in finance. Supporting the inclusive financial services. So, for instance, I visited one pilot project in Yunnan province. It's by Professor Yunus, the Grameen Bank. They had something like 13 people supporting 130 poor farmers in a mountainous area, and I visited the project, and I think they did a brilliant job. Very hard-working, very dedicated, devoted efforts, 13 people working for the whole year. But at the same time, I visited my bank in Hangzhou, a bank, online bank affiliated to the Alibaba Group. They have something like 700 staff in Hangzhou office, but serve more than 12 million SMEs and farmers within 1 year. They don't even see the people. So I think on the one hand, you could say this new model of banking. On the one hand, they probably destroyed a lot of jobs for bank employees because they only need 700 people and are serving more than 10 million SMEs and farmers. But at the same time, they actually served these potential customers that normally banks would be very reluctant to serve. Because they don't know how to assess their credit risks and so on. That actually created a lot of opportunities, not only for farmers, but also SMEs. As I mentioned earlier on, SMEs are now the key driver of both innovation and job creation. So I think it actually is having very positive impact on economic activities.
If I can just jump in, there is one point that I would like to highlight about the fourth industrial revolution that I think is very important for all of the countries in this region. And this comes back to the issue of human capital and skills. Because technology is changing very rapidly. Even if the robots are not going to very quickly take away jobs in manufacturing in most countries, maybe China is an exception. But the nature of jobs and the nature of tasks within occupations are going to change. And that requires a different sort of skill set that we've seen in the past. There are some estimates that, a large percentage of jobs will be automated away. I think most of those estimates may be overestimates. I think what is likely to happen is that tasks within jobs will be automated, and it will require a kind of adaptability and a flexibility on the part of the worker to be successful. But that adaptability and flexibility maybe shouldn't be taken for granted. This is something that really needs to be built into the education system. Again, sort of creative thinking, ability to work in teams, conversance with digital technologies. These are all things that are going to be increasingly important, whether in the third or in the fourth industrial revolution.
Can I just quickly jump in? I think that this links to an important issue, one important challenge of the fourth industrial revolution, which is what is the implications for inequality. And this is why we're talking so much about human capital in the education system, because if you actually don't provide these kind of skills that you were just mentioning, Andy, and if we leave so many people behind, and I think this is the concern that it was here in Malaysia, right? If you have so many of the students not actually learning, they might be in school, but they're not learning. The same is certainly true in Indonesia. And they're not able to get these jobs of the future, then what kind of income are they going to be able to earn, right? So is it universal basic income the answer? But I think that the challenge of actually increasing inequality, of potential increasing inequality with the fourth industrial revolution and the social implications of that, I think it's something that one needs to think about very carefully. And it brings back the importance of really providing high quality education, preventing stunting at all levels of the income distribution.
Yeah, actually, you raised a very important point, Dr. Gilsender, because inequality is not just restricted to, for example, racial inequality, but it's also gender inequality. And so there, from Cambodia, raises a very important point about gender inequality in developing countries. If the women folk don't get enough opportunities as the men folk, there's a patriarchy system that is permeating the developing world here. What are your points of view in terms of addressing this gender inequality? Perhaps we can start with Dr. Noine.
Yes. So I would say that Malaysia government policies have done a lot to try to mitigate the gap between the men and women in the labor force. So that is, so you can see in the labor market in Malaysia. So we have many female participations, like compared to some other ASEAN countries. But it is more of like traditional way of that creates the gap between the male and the females. So the traditional way, that means it is like the role of the female is, regardless of if you're working, you still have to take care of the family households. And that was one reason why I was running late this morning, because I still need to send my kids and stuff like that to school and prepare their breakfast. So what I'm saying is that it is more of the traditional mentality, that sometimes one might find it difficult to close the gap between the female and the male. But otherwise, I think the government incentives, government initiatives, in terms of promoting the jobs to the females that are out from the labor force for some time to come back after, let's say, maternity leaves, it's been a good part from the governments.
Certainly corporations and government, from a top-down perspective, they've done a lot. I mean, for example, the banks like CIMB have given as many as 4 months maternity leave, which is a big thing for employees now. But cultural norms are very difficult to address, right, Dr. Noine?
Yes.
This emanates from the family structure itself, not from a policy perspective. So how do you address that?
How do you address the cultural norms and the family structures? I would say that, when you have an incentives that gives both sides a win-win situations, then there will be more willingness from the other parties to participate. So for instance, if there is an incentives, not only incentives, but I would say that it's quite difficult to address the culture norms. Like usually most of the time we'll just follow with the culture, because that is the culture that binds us. Unless you have exposure of staying abroad and you have adapt to the living lifestyles abroad, then when you come back, is different way of living lifestyles that you are having. But if you have been brought up here and that is the way that things have been done, to go against something that has been done in generations is not something easy to change, even though if the government put in the initiatives like 4 months maternity leaves for the woman, but do they want to come back after that maternity leaves? They might want to come back, but they also might feel like inadequacy in terms of their skills, inadequacy in terms of their competitiveness to come back and compete with their colleagues at the office. So going against cultural norms and family structures that have been in place for generations is not something easy can be done. So
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you look at enrollments at tertiary institutions in Malaysia, the preponderance of females is very encouraging. But, as Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook once wrote in her book Lean In, she said that more women have got to decide not to enter the family structure or to get the husband to play his role in a more prominent basis. Are there economic repercussions from having, for example, on birth rates or from number of children who get to working age population within 20 years, of such a structure where perhaps there's fewer children and more women participating in the workforce? Maybe we can get to Dr. Gilsender's point of view on this.
I think that as I agree with what Dr. Narayan was saying, that it's important for the government to provide the right kind of setup in terms of policies, in terms of especially providing early childhood education. I think that this links back to some of the human capital agenda that we're saying, but also with participation of women in the labor market. If you have good quality early childhood education, if mothers feel comfortable leaving their children, then maybe that choice becomes easier in terms of going into the labor market. Going to the specific case of Indonesia and to the other end of the spectrum, we find that one of the best predictors as to whether a woman is going to be participating is actually that she is university educated. University education enrollment rates are still relatively low, so actually getting more women into universities in the case of Indonesia would also help increase the participation of women in the labor market.
Yeah, Professor Huang, China is 1.4 million people, but you've been practicing in your country a one-child policy, one family, one-child policy for numerous years, and recently withdrawn. How does China navigate this thorny issue of a system that benefits everybody?
Well, I think in terms of women's participation in the labor market, China is probably doing pretty well. I think the participation rate is actually high. But we do have the same problem going forward, and I think the issues we just discussed, if you look at, for instance, in the cities, even though the government has removed this one-child policy, the willingness to have more kids is still very limited. That's probably related to pressure from the jobs, but also the cost for the child care, also education, and so on. I think at the end of the day, for government policies, it's always a balance of cost and benefit. But the most important, I think, I agree. To the point just mentioned earlier, I think what the government needs to do is trying to create a more favorable environment in which the young people can have jobs, gentlemen or women, but at the same time, they can still decide and freely to have more kids if they wish.
Dr. Mason, yes.
Yeah, no, if I can pick up on some of the points that were made here. I think that, so East Asia in many ways has a favorable environment for girls as well as boys and women as well as men. Not equality, let's be very clear about that. But if we compare developing East Asia to other regions of the world, girls are getting as much, in some cases, more schooling than boys. Export-led manufacturing has led to, in many cases, more female employment than male employment. I think 70% of garment workers in export-oriented garment factories in Cambodia, for example, are women. This is a little different than saying that there's equality, but it's saying that there are some opportunities. Just on the point of cultural norms, I would say these are things that don't necessarily change easily, but they can be quite dynamic. And maybe the most dramatic example I can think of that doesn't come from the East Asia region, but comes from South Asia, where in Bangladesh, over a period of a generation, the government of Bangladesh has invested heavily in girls' education, starting at primary education, then in secondary education, has supported outward-oriented manufacturing, which has then subsequently drawn these educated women into garment factories, something that was not traditionally done in Bangladesh. So we've seen over a generation a kind of a change in the gender norms. Again, not equality, but a far cry from what we saw just a generation ago. So by analogy, and picking up on the point of Federico, there are things that governments in East Asia can do to incentivize greater equality in the workplace. And I think that's the next challenge for gender equality in the region. And I think whether it's early childhood development and education, or whether it's safe and affordable childcare to alleviate some of this burden that women feel trying to juggle a market and a household role, that there are certainly policies and investments that governments in the region can do to help foster, from an economic perspective, greater equality.
Absolutely.
I mean, just add very briefly, I think that governments also have a role in terms of the curriculum and the textbooks, right? Because a lot of the norms, they actually get created and perpetuated through the way that the textbooks actually portray the roles of men and women. So I think that there's an opportunity to instill children with, for example, that both the father and the mother need to share more of the responsibilities, and that will actually help women be able to take jobs more in the future.
Yeah, gentlemen and lady also, of course, inequality takes many forms, and this question is related to the haves and the have-nots. British from India talking about poverty alleviation without jeopardizing the larger national objectives. Many parts of the world have the gap between the wealthy and the not wealthy, the haves and the have-nots. Malaysia has a T20, the top 20, the M40, which is the middle 40%, and the bottom 40, which is the B40. And this is the perennial discussion going on at policy-making perspective. How do you uplift the bottom 40 without threatening the broader growth objectives of the country? And this is something which I think is a worldwide issue. Perhaps we can start with Dr. Nguyen. How do you think Malaysia is addressing this, bridging the wealth gap in this country?
Yes. The most important thing to me is that, there should be more trickle-down effect from, let's say, if you're working with companies, if you're working with the corporations, in terms of the wages that are given, there should be more trickle-down effect to the employees, to the bottom group that are working with the companies. So oftentimes the companies, the corporations, they have their certain profit margins. And so even though they're making more, there is limitations to amount of, wages that they are paying to their employers. So if we can promote more of the wage growth to the B40 groups, not only if they're working as an employee, but if they are, self-working, that means they are entrepreneurs, there should be more, trickle-down effect to them. So oftentimes, I think the wages are dampened, and the wage growth is also very stagnant and very marginal indeed in Malaysia. So if the wage growth for the medium income group is minimal, let alone or more so to the B40 group, so that's one thing in terms of the employment. And, the government's project of giving the cash handouts, like the BRIM, for instance, is only a short-term measures to make sure that their purchasing power of these groups are not affected. Because at that time when it was introduced, it was during the time when the subsidies was removed. And so we don't want the B40 group to be affected that much. And so the cash transfers was being given. But this cash transfers is only a short-term solutions, which over the period of time, it wouldn't be enough to offset, let's say, the increase in the prices of the goods and the services, especially the increase in the food prices. So how can we, provide them with more sustained ability to generate income to themselves? So, like we have mentioned about like training, for instance, upscaling them. So, the more sustainable measures, more, training and upscaling that will empower them to generate their own income that is sustainable. So I think that is the policies that the government should look at. How can we empower this B40 group so that they will be self-sustained in terms of their income generations?
Professor Wong, do you have a point of view in terms of addressing the gap between the wealthy and the not so wealthy in China? Because obviously
if you look at the Chinese experience last 40 years, the most effective way of alleviating poverty is through fast economic development. And you mentioned earlier, a lot of farmers came out of poverty because they moved to the cities and got a job in a labor-intensive manufacturing industry. That's the most effective way, and I don't think that will change going forward. But the Chinese government did start a new policy drive last year. They want to completely stamp out poverty within 3 years, which means next year. So that, I think, is making a bigger move across the country at the moment. My guess is that we're supporting economic development, creating jobs through the SMEs and so on. These will help further reducing the poverty. But if there are still some people left, then I think the last count at the beginning of last year was still 24 million people living under poverty line. And the number is being reduced, but I think over time, what is also important is that the government devise important social protection policies to support these people.
Yeah, there's a growing sense of a new kind of an economic model in this part of the world, especially China, where very much like how the renowned American economist Jeffrey Sachs wrote many years ago with his book Commonwealth, it is a paradigm in which the very rich are not many more times richer than the poorest individual. It's a concept where wealth is spread out among a broader swath of the economy and the population. I think this is a direction that China wants to go. You don't need 12 cars in your porch. You can just do with 1 or 2. You don't need 17 houses and bungalows. You can just make do with perhaps 1 or 2 in your dwelling. So that ensures a greater wealth spread among the population. Do you think, perhaps starting with you, Dr. Gilson, did you think this notion of a new view and interpretation of wealth and success and growth can permeate this region, which is specific to the needs of this region? Particularly with regard to the harm to the environment, and particularly with regard to the many millions of people in Asia who are still below the poverty line.
So I think that what's really been not controversial, and it kind of goes back to the theme of I think this discussion, is that it's key to provide equal opportunity. I think that should be uncontroversial, that whether your children are coming from rich families or poor families with the 17 bungalows or with not even having their own house, I think that investing in equal opportunities should really be something of a priority and something that should not be controversial. But yet, I think that we still are very far from actually having that, and as Andy, you were saying, I mean, this region has made great progress. So it's not as if this region is behind others in terms of providing equal opportunity. But even in this region with the great progress, you still have the kind of the stunting rates that we see in Indonesia. You still have the kind of the lack of access to education or to sanitation. So I think that there needs to be, a much greater concerted effort in many of the governments to really ensure that the basic services that are provided to all of its citizens are actually of good quality, that everyone can access a good education, and if by accessing good education you can actually get into a good university. And I think that we'll still have inequality issues after that, we'll still have the environmental issues that you mentioned that we'll have to address, but I think that we'll have a much more solid starting point, and this is something that really should not be ideological or controversial to provide everyone with a solid start.
Yeah, just to flesh out that idea a little bit more, Dr. Mason, this whole notion of a Western-led style of consumption growth, consumption-led economic growth, whereby you're cutting down trees and consuming more iPhones and fast foods, perhaps may not be a notion that is so relevant to our part of the world, especially with climate change very much a reality. Do you think that there's room for this discussion here, Dr. Mason?
Sorry?
In terms of not depending on growth that is led by consumption, but more a model of growth which is led by a more sustainable and more spread out layer of wealth among more people, not just the elite few, which is happening very much so in America.
Sure, so certainly. So I think, like Federico, I would say that the core of this idea is really around equality of opportunity. And in fact, the World Bank did a study not so long ago looking at intergenerational mobility, meaning how have children done compared to their parents in certain dimensions. And actually for developing regions, East Asia has been one of the most mobile regions in the world, meaning that, say in the case of education, that children have done better than their parents. And we've seen this for several subsequent generations. So there's some good news here. Now, there's still a long way to go, obviously, and it includes not only equality of opportunity in education, and that means not only enrollments, but getting back to this issue of quality that we were talking about before, but also having equal access to resources needed to be productive. So we were talking earlier about small and medium-sized enterprises having less access to finance, to capital. So this is an important area as well. Infrastructure, connecting remote areas to market centers, another area. Access to digital technologies, which we were talking about earlier. All of these things are important components of improving the landscape, I would say, with respect to equality of opportunity. Now, on your point about the environment, this is, I think, a very important one, which we've not talked about very much on the panel, but East Asia, collectively, the countries of East Asia, are the largest carbon emitters in the world. And although climate change is a global problem, there's plenty of scope to address this here at home, so to speak, within the region. So in that sense, absolutely, I would say it's important to begin to look at increasingly at low carbon strategies, or what we call in the World Bank green growth. And in fact, some of the leaders in terms of low carbon energy generation are in this region. China is one of the leaders globally on this in terms of building solar panels, in terms of battery storage, and so on. So this is an important future component. I think there's no getting away from it. We have to think about a low carbon future for this region.
Absolutely. On the theme of inclusiveness, Professor Huang, this question comes in regarding China. It's anonymous, but it's very relevant because I think despite perhaps Donald Trump's best efforts, China will be a very, very major player in the region, if not the world, for the next 70 to 80 years. How are you going to lead the way in terms of ensuring economic wealth for all on a sustainable front, especially with regards to the overtures your government is doing with regards to climate change?
Inclusiveness and climate change.
Sustainable wealth.
Sustainable wealth, is certainly what the government is trying to pursue. What they call harmonized society, which means everybody share from the economic development. In this case, I think there are a number of the areas we could look at. Number one, as I said, the government is stepping up the efforts, building a more effective social protection scheme, and especially for the disadvantaged population. That's one thing. The second thing, as I said, is probably more important is through development and provide equal opportunities for everybody, and including this new industrial revolution we mentioned. In fact, the new industrial revolution is providing huge opportunities for the SMEs to grow, because the SMEs contribute something like 90% of the jobs in the country. And if we're able to create a more harmonized or friendly policy environment, including through better access to finance, that certainly would do much better in supporting a sustainable development. The last point is, I think if you look at the government policy, during the first 40 years of economic reform from 1978 to 2018, average GDP growth rate was something like slightly above 9%. And that's a remarkable achievement. But the government now is focusing a lot more on quality of growth instead of quantity of growth. Quality means the more balanced growth, more equitable income distribution, but better protection of the environment. In fact, another policy drive the government is driving, and in addition to what I just mentioned earlier, stamping out the poverty, is also the environmental protection policy that is having a big impact on the economy at the moment. So I think with all these efforts, I can't say we're already there, but I think that China certainly is moving in the right direction.
Okay, we've got about 7 to 8 minutes left. I'm going to allow Dr. Mason to have the last word, but perhaps from Dr. Gilsander and Dr. Noain, your quick wrap-ups and your summary outlooks in terms of ensuring sustainable jobs and wealth creation for Indonesia and Malaysia. Maybe you start with Dr. Gilsander?
So in the case of Indonesia, I think that I would start with these 3 key gaps that need to be closed. We talked a lot about human capital, so clearly the human capital gap, making sure that the future labor force is ready for Industry 4.0 by eliminating stunting, by improving on the quality of education, investing in teachers. 50% of teachers in Indonesia retire in the next 5 years, so there's a huge opportunity there to really kind of step up the quality of teachers and improve the quality of basic education. Retraining the existing labor force through vocational training. You have a lot of people that need to be reskilled. So closing this human capital gap is going to be key to jobs in the future. Infrastructure gap, continuing to close infrastructure gap. This is something that a lot of progress has been achieved in the last 5 years, but Indonesia still has a very large gap in terms of both road networks, energy, ports that can be closed in order to connect the remote islands to also promote more equality. And finally, this gap in terms of efficient delivery and attracting of the efficient investments through higher FDI that will help to bring in technology and create more high-quality jobs.
Okay, I'm afraid we've got 3 minutes left. So, Dr. Noy, 1.5 to you, and Dr. Mason, 1.5 to you.
So I'll just go first. Yes. So I think the only point that I wanted to make here is to encourage the government to increase the R&D spending. Not only R&D spending that often given to the universities and the research institutes, but also R&D spending especially to the SMEs, and ensuring that SMEs, when they're doing this research and development, it is connected to the universities and other research institutes. And when they have the innovations, how can we commercialize the innovations that they have had? So it's more about like boosting the R&D and connecting the manufacturing industries to the universities and the research institutes.
Excellent.
That's my final point.
Excellent. Dr. Mason, last word belongs to you.
Okay, perfect. So East Asia has been a tremendously successful region in terms of economic growth and poverty reduction. But what has been successful in the past is not necessarily going to be successful in the future in a rapidly changing world, with trade patterns changing, with technology changing. So to take the opportunities, countries in developing East Asia will need to focus on things like opening up and reforming services sectors to take advantage of those opportunities, innovation, strengthening financial architecture to make sure that small and medium-sized enterprises can also grow. And, of course, the skills agenda that we've been talking about very much. So I think these are key elements to the future of growth and job creation in the region.
Excellent. Thank you. Professor Huang, Dr. Gilsander, Dr. Mason, and Dr. Noy, thank you all for your time. Stay tuned. There will be much more content from the World Bank's Econothon for the next few hours. If you can, take the time out, please, to like at World Bank on Facebook. Thank you.
Urbanization has been good for East Asia, contributing to steady growth and poverty reduction. On average, the region has been urbanizing at about 2.4% per year, and much of that is driven by China, which has invested heavily in urbanization as a development priority, but also by Indonesia, Vietnam, and some of the Pacific Islands, where urbanization is driven by people moving to cities to seek better quality of life, jobs, and services. But many of East Asia's cities face challenges related to congestion, pollution, and housing, which have significant costs to the urban economy and mean that countries are not fully reaping the benefits of urbanization. This is caused by rapid and unplanned growth. Cities simply can't keep up with the needs for infrastructure and affordable housing for residents. And that has meant many people end up living in slums. There are an estimated 250 million people living in slums in the region, not just in megacities, but also in medium and smaller cities. A second big cause is disasters. East Asia and the Pacific is the most disaster-stricken region in the world. It's affected by small recurrent events as well as high-impact events like cyclones and typhoons. Cities bear the brunt of disasters, and within them, it's the urban poor that are the most affected. Our diagnostic work has been an entry point for the World Bank to address some of these key urbanization challenges in the region. In countries such as China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Malaysia, we've carried out urbanization reports that use cutting-edge geospatial and other diagnostic tools to provide the basis for understanding urbanization challenges and prioritizing solutions to inform both national-level strategies as well as our own World Bank lending. We have a large portfolio of projects. Among the main themes that we are addressing are urban infrastructure and municipal finance, where we support facilities or funds that help to appraise, manage, and leverage financing sources for sustainable infrastructure in places like Shanghai, Vietnam, and Indonesia. We work on urban resilience projects that address the impacts of natural hazards and build resilience in cities such as Yangon or Jakarta, where frequent flooding can shut down parts of the city and have devastating economic impacts. We also work in poor communities through slum upgrading and basic service provision with projects in Indonesia, Vietnam, Vanuatu, and elsewhere. In addition to physical investments, these projects tackle some of the most difficult and messy issues related to land, but with innovative solutions that help to improve living conditions for the urban poor. Our work in Indonesia provides a concrete example of how we're helping to tackle these problems holistically. About 55% of Indonesia's population lives in urban areas, and that number is expected to increase by another 80 million, reaching 70% of the population in 2045. We've developed a strong partnership with the government, which has both breadth and depth, meaning we work at the national level, bringing together various sectors, but also go deep into some of the big challenges that cities face. For example, a regional infrastructure fund helps to increase access to infrastructure finance at the subnational level. A national slum upgrading project works in low-income communities across Indonesia on improving access to clean water, sanitation, and roads, and on integrating these communities into the fabric of the city. There's also a national affordable housing project which focuses on some of the broader supply and demand issues relating to affordable housing, and the National Urban Development Project, which provides technical assistance to city governments to help them make data-informed decisions for sustainable urban development that's then linked with capital investment decisions across sectors. Beyond these projects, we also have a robust program of diagnostic work. We have a major report on urbanization that was requested by the government and is about to be released. This process involved numerous consultations with government to deepen our dialogue on these issues, and these programs have then been further leveraged with co-financing from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and other partners to maximize our impact and help Indonesia create livable, equitable, and sustainable cities. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the World Bank Econothon on Human Capital. My name is Rodrigo Chavez. I am the Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste. The Human Capital Index of Indonesia is 0.53, which means that today's children will be only 53% as productive as the children of those countries which are at the frontier, are the countries that have an index of close to 1. That's a substantial difference. Imagine today that we have estimated that if Indonesia closes its human capital gap, the economy of this country and the per capita income of this country would be 36% higher than what is today. That's a very substantial amount. So in Indonesia, what we see is that people could be more productive than what they are today. They could be healthier, they could be more educated, and they could be better trained. So the government of Indonesia has begun a number of initiatives aimed at precisely addressing those three concerns. In terms of health, the most important one relates to a national platform to eliminate stunting, which still affects 30% of the children under 5. For a human to be productive, they have to be educated, and for them to be educated, their brains have to be fully developed. Stunting in early childhood prevents the brain from developing normally. The program that the government has undertaken is already yielding results. Only 4 or 5 years ago, the rate of stunting in this country was 37% among the children of age 5 or below. Today is 30%. We are confident that the implementation of this platform, of the policies in this platform, will lead to continued declines in the rate of stunting in this country. We expect that the future labor force is going to be better able to learn and more productive than the present labor force. The government is also trying to improve education outcomes. Indonesia spends 20% of their national budget on education. That's a lot. Unfortunately, there is a lot of room still to improve educational outcomes, where the PISA indicators show that Indonesian children are not as well prepared, as well educated as children in most other countries. The government is initiating a national program to improve skills and vocational training. That is very good because it will help the workers of the present labor market become more productive. We at the World Bank will continue working with the government of Indonesia in improving the education of children who attend religious schools to make sure that they have good opportunities to perform well in the labor market of the future. We are looking at a government that is investing a lot in education and which wants that expenditure to be more effective in achieving better outcomes. The health of the entire population is also being improved. Investments in the capital that they have within themselves are highly profitable investments. President Joko Widodo, in a speech where he positioned the vision for his next administration, the vision of the future of Indonesia, named improving the human capital of this country among the 5 top priorities that he sees for his administration and for the future of the country. This priority is encouraging, and we wish Indonesia great success and stand ready to continue working with the government and the people of this great country in achieving the objective of having more and better human capital well distributed among the entire population. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Martin Reiser. I'm the country director of the World Bank for China, Mongolia, and Korea. And I want to talk to you about aging in the East Asia Pacific region and why this matters for economic development. To do that, I want to present you with a few numbers. 170 million is the number of elderly people that China will gain between now and 2040. 130 million is the number of working age population that China will lose between now and 2040. You can imagine that that creates a very significant burden. 4.5% of GDP, in fact, is what Denmark spends on its elderly alone. So you can see where this might be going for China, even if it isn't quite as generous as Denmark in providing for its elderly. 2.5% was the contribution of labor force growth to economic growth in China between 1978 and 1998. But from now on, this contribution will be zero until 2030, and it will be minus 0.05% per year after 2030, when the labor force will start to decline. And so China needs to adjust. Aging is nothing new. European societies have aged for several decades. In fact, France has been going through its demographic transition over the last 100 years. But China is aging much more rapidly, going through the same demographic transition in just about one generation. This requires policies to be adjusted with much more urgency. The elderly today lead much healthier lives, and as a result can make a productive contribution to the economy for much longer than they used to do in the past. We call this the silver economy, and it's a potential new source of growth. At the same time, by making adjustments to working places, we can make sure that people make a much longer contribution to the economy. We can train them so that the demographic cliff turns more into a demographic glide. That will require continuous investments in upgrading skills. Lifelong learning is very important in today's aging and technologically rapidly changing societies. And finally, by changing the financing models of our social security systems and our healthcare systems, we can make sure that the growing burden of aging doesn't break the bank and becomes fiscally and financially sustainable both for the state and for households. These are policy lessons that we're trying to apply in China, and we've been working with them on analysis, but also through projects in trying to implement some of these policy lessons. We have worked initially on analyzing the pace of aging, analyzing the implications for public finances, analyzing the implications for labor force growth and for productivity. And now we're implementing some of these lessons in Anhui, in Fujian, and Guizhou. We're working to strengthen the stewardship function of the state, because the state alone cannot hope to deal with the problems of aging. It requires partnership with the private sector, with households, with communities. In fact, we're working on developing a basic age package so that healthcare becomes, aged care becomes affordable or stays affordable and is equitably provided to all. Those that require more services can privately insure. And we're working to develop home-based and community-based care models that can deliver aged care more cost-effectively and in a way that is more attuned to local needs and requirements. This all requires continued oversight and control by the state so that inequalities in provision are avoided. And finally, we're trying to draw lessons from all of this work in China for other countries in East Asia Pacific and beyond, because we believe that aging is here to stay. Aging is predictable. Policies can be changed to adapt and turn aging from a burden into an opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us on this segment of the World Bank Group's 24-hour Econothon, brought to you by the East Asia Pacific region. Please stay tuned as we hand over to our colleagues in Washington, D.C. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. If you want to learn more, please visit our website, worldbank.org/EAP.